In the winter of 1864, a Union cavalry patrol discovered something in a burned-out plantation house outside Macon, Georgia, that their commanding officer refused to include in his official report. The soldiers found 7 burial sites in the cellar, each containing bones that showed signs of systematic butchering. But what disturbed the lieutenant most wasn't what they found in those graves. It was the family Bible on the dining room table, where someone had carefully recorded the birth of 12 sons, yet the 1860 census listed only daughters. Before we dive into the story, if you're drawn to the darkest corners of history, where truth becomes more terrifying than any fiction, then you've found your community. These are the stories that textbooks won't teach, the chapters of human darkness that historians whisper about in archives. Click the like button and subscribe. I love hearing from you. Where are you watching from? And is it day or night there? Now let's continue with the story. The Varden plantation occupied 300 acres of red Georgia clay, 12 miles south of Macon, where the Ocmulgee River bent through pine forests thick enough to swallow screams. County records from 1842 show that Colonel Henry Varden purchased the land with inherited tobacco money, built a columned manor house in the Greek Revival style, and established himself among the plantation aristocracy. He married Temperance Blackwell that same year, a union celebrated in the Macon Telegraph Society pages as joining 2 of Georgia's finest families. But the Varden name carried weight for reasons beyond wealth. Temperance came from a bloodline whose genealogical records stretched back to colonial Virginia, meticulously documented in leather-bound volumes that traced every birth, marriage, and death through 5 generations. She brought these books to her marriage like a dowry, and neighbors would later recall how she studied them by candlelight, her finger tracing lines of ancestry as though reading scripture. The first Varden son was born in 1843. The birth announcement in the Telegraph called him Henry Jr., described him as robust and healthy. The death notice appeared 6 weeks later. Fever, the notice claimed, though the attending physician noted in his private journal that the infant showed no signs of illness when he examined the body. He wrote that Temperance had seemed eerily calm, almost satisfied, as she handed him the small corpse wrapped in embroidered linen. 3 more sons followed over the next decade. Each birth was recorded in the family Bible with careful penmanship. Each death came within the first year, and each time, the causes grew vaguer in official records. By 1853, when the 4th boy died, the local physician refused to attend Varden births anymore. A midwife from Macon took over, a practical woman named Mrs. Sarah Hendricks, whose diary would later provide investigators with their first glimpse into the darkness gathering at the plantation. Colonel Varden died in 1857, thrown from his horse on a road he had traveled 1,000 times. The coroner ruled it accidental, but several enslaved people who worked the Varden property would later testify that they had heard terrible arguments from the main house in the weeks before, screaming about the boys and what she made him do. After his death, Temperance took complete control of the plantation, managing it with ruthless efficiency, while her 5 surviving daughters grew into young women who never left the property, never entertained suitors, never smiled when visitors came calling. By 1860, when census takers arrived, the plantation had acquired a reputation among neighboring farms. Workers reported sounds at night that didn't match any animal they knew. Smoke rose from the kitchen house at strange hours, and the Varden women moved through their vast, columned home like ghosts, their windows always shuttered, their doors always locked, keeping secrets that the Georgia red clay would soon be forced to reveal. The 5 Varden daughters existed in a hierarchy as rigid as their mother's genealogical charts. Eleanor, the eldest at 31 in 1860, managed the household accounts with mathematical precision. Catherine, 29, oversaw the kitchen and food stores with an intensity that unsettled the enslaved women who worked under her direction. The 3 younger sisters, Margaret, Constance, and Abigail, ranging from 27 to 23, performed their duties with the mechanical efficiency of people who had long ago stopped questioning their lives. None had married, despite coming from wealth and bearing the kind of classical features that plantation society prized. Visitors to the Varden home before Colonel Varden's death remarked on the daughters' strange demeanor. They spoke in near whispers, avoided direct eye contact, and excused themselves from rooms whenever conversation turned to children or family. A letter from Mrs. Beatrice Sutherland, written to her sister in 1855, described attending a ladies' social at the Varden plantation. "The daughters moved like shadows," she wrote. "When my hostess asked Catherine about marriage prospects, the girl's hands began to shake so violently she dropped her teacup. Temperance simply smiled and said her daughters had higher purposes. The nature of those purposes emerged gradually in documents discovered decades later. A tin box buried beneath the kitchen house foundation contained letters the daughters had exchanged among themselves, pages they must have hidden from their mother's eyes. Margaret's handwriting appeared in a letter dated March 1861, addressed to Eleanor, but never delivered. "I cannot do it again," she wrote. "When the next one comes, I will run into the river rather than sit at that table. You were only 12 when it started. You don't remember refusing. I do. I remember what Mother did to Catherine when she refused. The scars on her back spell out our family name." Mrs. Sarah Hendricks, the midwife who attended Varden births after the local physician's departure, kept detailed records that violated every standard of professional discretion. Her diary entries from 1858 through 1862 read like dispatches from a war zone. In June of 1858, she recorded delivering a healthy male infant to Catherine Varden, unmarried, the father's identity never disclosed. "The child was perfect," Hendricks wrote. 8 pounds, strong lungs, good color. Mrs. Temperance took him from my arms before I could finish the cleaning. She said I was to return in 1 week to confirm the child's health, but I was not to come sooner under any circumstances. When I asked to see the infant properly settled, she offered me $50 to leave immediately. I took the money and have prayed every night since for forgiveness." Hendricks returned 1 week later to find the infant dead. The entry in her diary noted signs that troubled her medical understanding. The child showed no evidence of disease or natural death. The body had been washed and dressed in elaborate christening clothes, but I observed marks on the small limbs that resembled kitchen preparation. When I expressed concern, Mrs. Temperance informed me that I had been paid for my silence as well as my service. She reminded me that my husband owed the Varden family $300, a debt that could be called immediately or forgiven entirely, depending on my discretion. 4 more times over the next 4 years, Hendricks attended births at the Varden plantation. Each time, a daughter bore a son. Each time, the midwife was dismissed before she could properly care for the infant. Each time, she returned a week later to find the child dead, and the mother's eyes hollow with something far worse than grief. In her final entry about the Vardens, dated January 1862, Hendricks wrote a single sentence that investigators would later struggle to interpret. "They have begun to believe it will work." The daughters' isolation deepened as the war consumed Georgia. Supply lines collapsed, making the plantation's self-sufficiency crucial. The women worked alongside enslaved laborers in the fields, their fine dresses replaced by rough cotton, their hands developing calluses. But even as Confederate defeat became inevitable, even as neighboring plantations evacuated or burned, the Varden women remained. A traveling Presbyterian minister who stopped seeking shelter in November 1863 recorded that temperance turned him away at gunpoint. Through the parlor window, he glimpsed the daughters seated around the dining table, their faces illuminated by candlelight, their lips moving in unison as though reciting something they had memorized long ago. Whatever they were waiting, for whatever ritual they believed would break their family's curse, the approaching Union Army would interrupt it, but not before one final attempt, one last desperate feeding of the bloodline that would leave evidence even fire couldn't completely erase. By autumn of 1863, the war had transformed Georgia into a landscape of smoke and desperation. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman's forces pushed deeper into Confederate territory, leaving scorched earth and empty towns in their wake. The Varden plantation, isolated by design and geography, became even more unreachable as roads deteriorated and neighbors fled. Mail stopped arriving. Supply wagons avoided the area entirely. The plantation existed in a bubble of silence, broken only by the distant thunder of artillery that grew closer each week. Confederate deserters moved through the Georgia wilderness like ghosts, men who had watched their units disintegrate at Chattanooga and chosen survival over loyalty. One such man, Private Daniel Yost of the 48th Georgia Infantry, surrendered to Union forces in February 1865. During his interrogation, recorded by a Captain William Reeves, Yost provided testimony that military authorities quickly suppressed. The transcript survived only because Reeves kept a personal copy, filing it among his private papers with a note. This man is either mad or has witnessed something that should never be spoken of again. Yost claimed he reached the Varden plantation on December 19, 1863, after 3 days without food. Smoke rose from the kitchen house chimney, a sign of habitation that drew him like a beacon. He approached carefully, calling out his need for shelter and willing to work for a meal. Eleanor Varden met him at the main house door, her face gaunt but composed. She studied him for a long moment before inviting him inside. The house was grand, but felt like a tomb. Yost told his interrogators. Every curtain drawn, every mirror covered with black cloth. 6 women sat in the parlor, doing needlework by lamplight, not speaking, not looking at each other. The oldest one, Mrs. Temperance, watched me like I was livestock. She asked if I had family waiting for me, if anyone knew my location. When I said I was alone, she smiled. They fed him in the dining room at a table set with china too fine for wartime. Yost described venison stew, fresh bread, preserved vegetables from the root cellar. The daughters served him without speaking, moving in choreographed precision. Temperance asked him questions about the war, about Confederate troop movements, about which way he planned to travel. He answered honestly, grateful for the food, planning to leave at first light. Then Mrs. Temperance rang a small bell. Yost's testimony continued. The daughters brought out another course, a roasted meat I didn't recognize. Too small for pig, too tender for venison. It had been prepared with herbs, arranged on a platter like something for a celebration. Mrs. Temperance said it was a family recipe, that they only prepared it on special occasions. She said eating it would make me part of their bloodline, that I would be bound to them. The youngest daughter, Abigail, began weeping silently. Catherine reached over and gripped her wrist so tightly that Yost heard bones creak. Temperance continued serving, placing portions on each plate with ritualistic care. She began speaking in a low voice about genealogy, about bloodlines, about sons who had failed, and the methods required to strengthen what was weak. She said their family had learned the old ways, Yost testified. That consumption of failed male children would eventually produce a son strong enough to survive. That they had been too timid before, too incomplete in their commitment. But this time, they had waited the full year. This time, the boy had lived 11 months before the fever took him. This time, they had prepared him properly. Yost ran. He overturned the table, smashed through a window, and fled into the December darkness with the daughter's screams following him. He traveled north by starlight, avoiding all roads, eating bark and frozen creek water rather than approach another dwelling. When Union soldiers captured him 6 weeks later, he was delirious and 50 pounds lighter. The interrogating officers noted that he bore scars on his arms, consistent with breaking through glass, supporting at least part of his story. Captain Reeves rode to the Varden plantation in late February 1864 to investigate. He found the house already burning, the fire still recent enough that timbers glowed red in the winter dawn. Whatever had happened there in the weeks after Yost's escape, someone had decided that fire would provide better answers than testimony ever could. Lieutenant James Cortland led a 12-man cavalry patrol through the pine forests south of Macon on February 23, 1864. Their orders were reconnaissance, mapping Confederate supply routes, and identifying structures that might harbor enemy forces. The column of smoke rising from the Varden plantation drew them off their assigned route. Cortland expected to find another casualty of Sherman's advance, another planter family's wealth reduced to ash and memory. What they found instead would haunt every man present for the remainder of his life. The main house had collapsed into its own cellar, roof timbers forming a skeletal cage above smoldering foundation stones. The fire had burned hot enough to crack the brick chimneys, suggesting accelerant had been used. Cortland's sergeant, a practical Pennsylvanian named Thomas Birch, noted that the kitchen house stood untouched 50 yards away, its chimney cold. Someone had chosen to burn only the main structure. Private letters written by 3 different soldiers in Cortland's unit provide overlapping accounts of what happened next. Corporal Edwin March wrote to his wife that the smell hit them before they dismounted, something underneath the wood smoke that made his stomach turn. Like a butcher shop left closed in summer, he described it, but worse somehow, sweeter and more terrible. They found the family Bible on what remained of the dining room floor, protected from the flames by a cast-iron stove that had collapsed over it. The book's genealogical pages were intact, filled with Temperance Varden's meticulous handwriting. 12 sons listed across 3 generations of Varden women, each with a birth date recorded in blue ink and a death date added later in red. The dates formed a pattern that Sergeant Birch noticed immediately. Every male child died between 6 weeks and 11 months of age. The final entry showed a boy named Samuel, born to Catherine Varden on January 12, 1863. Died December 15, 1863. 11 months exactly. The cellar entrance stood open, stone steps descending into darkness. Cortland ordered torches lit. What the soldiers found below contradicted every assumption they had made about civilized warfare and human nature. 7 burial plots had been dug into the cellar's dirt floor, each marked with a wooden cross bearing a name and date. The fire's heat had caused the ground to settle, partially exposing what lay beneath. Private Michael Dunn, a medical orderly before the war, examined the remains. His official report, filed with the provost marshal in Macon, used clinical language to describe what they uncovered. Small bones, consistent with infants and young children. Evidence of systematic disarticulation performed with sharp implements. Cut marks on rib bones and long bones that matched butchering techniques rather than burial preparation. In 6 of the 7 graves, the skulls had been split open from behind. But the 7th grave held something different. A wooden box, carefully sealed with wax, contained a complete infant skeleton still dressed in rotting christening clothes. Beneath the small body, they found a leather journal in Temperance Varden's handwriting. The entries began in 1843 and ended January 4, 1864, 6 weeks before the patrol's arrival. Cortland read enough of the journal to understand what had occurred in the Varden house across 2 decades. The entries detailed a progression from grief to obsession to methodical horror. Temperance had convinced herself that her family carried a curse that killed male children, a weakness in the bloodline that could only be corrected through ritual consumption. She cited obscure texts, claimed knowledge passed down from her grandmother, described visions that instructed her in the proper preparation and timing. The later entries grew more desperate. After each failed attempt, she refined her methods. She noted which parts must be consumed, which rituals must be performed, how long the child must live before the sacrifice would be effective. The final entry expressed triumph. Samuel had survived almost a year. His strength meant the ritual would finally work. She had gathered all 5 daughters for the meal on December 18th. She had made them consume specific portions while reciting family names stretching back to colonial Virginia. And now we wait, the entry concluded. Within 3 months, a daughter will quicken with child. This time, a son will survive. This time, the bloodline will be redeemed. Cortland ordered the cellar sealed. He confiscated the journal and Bible, sent them under armed guard to headquarters. Then he made a decision that military historians still debate. He reported finding evidence of civilian deaths, but omitted the details that mattered most. His official dispatch described probable Confederate atrocities, likely committed by irregulars or deserters. He never mentioned the journal, the systematic nature of the graves, or the terrible logic that had driven the Varden women to their final meal. The Varden women were not in the burned house. Cortland's men searched the surrounding acreage, expecting to find bodies in the woods or fleeing figures on the roads leading away from the property. They found neither. The plantation's enslaved population had vanished as well, leaving behind only empty cabins and cold fire pits. The entire human landscape had been swept clean, as though everyone who knew what happened in that house had simply evaporated into the Georgia wilderness. It would take testimony from freed people, gathered months later by Freedmen's bureau agents, to reconstruct the final days of the Varden family. A woman named Ruth, who had worked in the Varden kitchen house for 15 years, provided the most detailed account during an interview in August 1865. She had fled the plantation on January 20th, 1864, along with 11 other enslaved workers who scattered in different directions rather than remain one more night on that cursed ground. Ruth described the household's atmosphere after the December meal with clinical precision. Miss Temperance grew stranger by the day, she testified. She would stand in the parlor for hours, staring at nothing, whispering numbers under her breath. Counting days, I think, waiting for signs that one of her daughters carried a child. The daughters stopped speaking entirely. They moved through the house like sleepwalkers, performing their tasks, but never meeting each other's eyes. By mid-January, the delusion had metastasized into something darker. Temperance began conducting physical examinations of her daughters each morning, checking for signs of pregnancy with an intensity that terrified everyone in the household. She consulted her genealogical charts constantly, calculating optimal conception dates, cross-referencing family patterns that existed only in her fractured mind. When 2 weeks passed with no positive signs, she started forcing the daughters to drink herbal cellar, concoctions that Ruth recognized as abortifacients, convinced that failed pregnancies were being hidden from her. On January 19th, Ruth's testimony continued. Miss Catherine tried to run. She made it as far as the front gate before Miss Eleanor and Miss Margaret dragged her back. Mrs. Temperance beat her in the front yard with a fireplace poker, while the other daughters watched. She kept screaming that Catherine had ruined everything, that her disobedience had poisoned the ritual. That night, we heard Catherine weeping in her room. Before dawn, she had stopped. The household staff gathered in the slave quarters that evening, making whispered plans to flee. Ruth remembered the terror of waiting for darkness, knowing that morning might bring something worse than anything they had already witnessed. Just before midnight, screaming erupted from the main house. Not Catherine's voice this time, but all 5 daughters together. A collective howling that sent every person on the plantation running for the woods. Ruth paused in her testimony, her hands gripping the table. The Freedmen's Bureau agent noted that she required several minutes to compose herself before continuing. "I looked back once," she said. "I saw Mrs. Temperance standing in the doorway holding a lamp. Behind her, the daughters were destroying the house, smashing furniture, tearing down curtains, breaking every mirror and window. Mrs. Temperance just stood there watching them, smiling like she was proud." A formerly enslaved man named Isaac, interviewed separately, corroborated Ruth's timeline. He had hidden in the pine forest rather than running, wanting to ensure the other workers escaped safely. He watched the Varden house until dawn. Around 3 in the morning, the destruction stopped. The daughters emerged carrying bundles wrapped in sheets and tablecloths. They walked past their mother without speaking, heading south toward the river. Temperance remained in the doorway for another hour. Then she went back inside. Isaac saw lamplight moving from room to room, methodical and purposeful. When dawn came, smoke began rising from multiple points in the house simultaneously. Temperance never emerged. She had sealed herself inside the only world where her delusions made sense, choosing immolation over facing what she had created. The daughters, meanwhile, vanished into a landscape consumed by war. 5 women carrying mysterious bundles, walking away from the only home they had ever known, leaving behind a burning monument to 20 years of methodical horror. Where they went, what they carried, and what became of them would obsess investigators for decades. But in those first chaotic months of 1864, they simply dissolved into the chaos of Sherman's march. 5 more refugees in a state full of displaced souls seeking shelter from truths too terrible to speak aloud. Lieutenant Cortland delivered Temperance Varden's journal to Union headquarters in Macon on February 26, 1864. The Provost Marshal, Colonel Augustus Kane, read it behind closed doors with 2 staff officers present. According to a letter Kane wrote to his brother that evening, the journal contained over 200 pages of meticulous documentation spanning 21 years. What began as a grieving mother's attempt to understand her son's deaths had transformed into a blueprint for ritualized murder, justified through pseudoscientific genealogy and occult conviction. The earliest entries, written after the first son's death in 1843, showed a rational woman grappling with medical uncertainty. Temperance consulted physicians, researched childhood diseases, questioned her own health during pregnancy. She documented every detail of the infant's brief life, searching for patterns that might explain his sudden decline. But even these early pages contained seeds of the obsession that would consume her. She mentioned her grandmother's warnings about weakness in the male line, references to stillborn boys in previous generations, whispers about ancestral curses that her mother had dismissed as superstition. By the third son's death in 1850, the journal's tone had shifted dramatically. Temperance described dreams where her grandmother appeared, speaking in languages Temperance didn't recognize, but somehow understood. The old woman showed her techniques used by their ancestors, methods of preserving bloodline strength through consumption of the weak. She told me that noble families throughout history have known this truth, Temperance wrote, that the Romans practiced it, that European royalty maintained their lines through secret rituals, that only those willing to sacrifice could produce worthy heirs. Colonel Kane's letter noted that the journal included hand-drawn anatomical diagrams showing which portions of an infant's body contained the essence necessary for the ritual. Temperance had created a system of preparation that mimicked religious sacrament. Specific organs consumed by specific family members in precise order. Prayers recited in corrupted Latin that she claimed came from medieval texts. Time intervals that had to be observed between death and consumption to preserve the child's life force. The journal revealed that Colonel Varden had participated in the first ritual, the consumption of their second son in 1847. His initial resistance had crumbled under Temperance's conviction that this was their only path to a surviving male heir. But after the third son's death and third ritual in 1850, he began questioning whether they were honoring their ancestors or defying God. His doubts intensified after the fourth son died in 1853, despite their increasingly elaborate preparations. Henry has become an obstacle, Temperance wrote in March 1857, 2 months before her husband's fatal riding accident. He speaks of confession, of seeking spiritual counsel, of stopping. He does not understand that we are too deep in the work to turn back. The bloodline demands completion. Our ancestors demand it. The sons we have honored demand it. Whether Temperance caused her husband's death remained speculation, but the journal made clear that his departure freed her to fully control her daughter's participation. Entries from 1858 through 1863 documented a systematic program of psychological manipulation and physical coercion. She isolated the daughters from outside contact, controlled their reading material, conducted daily instruction sessions where she read from her genealogical texts and explained their sacred duty to the family line. The daughters' resistance appeared in marginal notes they had added to certain pages, tiny rebellious scratches in different handwriting. Next to a passage where Temperance described the ritual consumption of Catherine's son in 1858. Someone had written, "Mother made us. We begged her to stop." Beside an entry detailing the preparation methods, another daughter had added, "This is not salvation. This is damnation." But the most chilling discovery came in the journal's final pages. Temperance had begun planning for a scenario where the rituals continued to fail. She had calculated that if no son survived by 1865, she would need to expand the bloodline through forced unions with carefully selected men. She had already identified candidates, deserters, and drifters who could be lured to the plantation, used for breeding, and then, her words implied, incorporated into the ritual itself. The male essence need not come only from failed sons, she wrote in her final entry. Any male consumed by Varden women strengthens the line. Samuel's death proves we are close. One more attempt, properly executed, and our family will finally produce a son worthy of our name. Colonel Kane ordered the journal locked in his personal safe. He never filed it as evidence, never mentioned its contents in official correspondence. Some truths, he decided, served no purpose beyond spreading the contagion of madness that had already destroyed one family completely. Colonel Kane's decision to suppress the journal lasted exactly 9 days. On March 6, 1864, 2 farmers discovered a body in a drainage ditch 7 miles south of the Varden plantation. The woman had been dead approximately 2 weeks, her corpse preserved by winter cold. A waterlogged travel bag nearby contained identification papers for Margaret Varden, age 27, along with a bundle wrapped in oilcloth that the farmers wisely chose not to open before alerting authorities. Lieutenant Cortland examined the body and the bundle. His report to Kane noted that Margaret showed no signs of violence or struggle. She had simply laid down in the ditch and died, her hands folded across her chest in a pose suggesting peaceful resignation. The bundle contained portions of an infant skeleton, wrapped individually in embroidered handkerchiefs, each bone labeled with neat handwriting, identifying it as belonging to Samuel Varden, deceased December 15, 1863. Kane authorized a search operation. 40 soldiers spread across the countryside south of Macon, following reported sightings of women traveling alone or in pairs. The war made such searches nearly impossible. Refugees clogged every road. Displaced families camped in pine forests. Deserters from both armies moved through the landscape like shadows. Distinguishing the Varden daughters from thousands of other desperate women proved futile. On March 14th, a cavalry patrol found Eleanor Varden's body hanging from an oak tree near the Flint River, 15 miles southwest of the plantation. She had used her own dress to fashion a noose, climbed onto a fallen log, and stepped off into empty air. No note, no explanation, just another corpse in a state already thick with them. Unlike Margaret, Eleanor carried nothing except a small Bible with all the male names carefully crossed out in black ink. The discovery of Catherine Varden came 6 days later, though identifying her required testimony from freed people who had known the family. She had walked into a Union Army camp near Fort Valley, barefoot and incoherent, speaking in fragments about feeding the bloodline and breaking curses. The camp surgeon sedated her, noting in his medical log that she showed signs of severe malnutrition and self-inflicted wounds on her forearms. She died that night without regaining clarity. Her last words recorded as, "It didn't work. Mother lied. It never worked." 3 daughters dead. 2 missing. Kane convened a meeting with his senior staff on March 22nd to discuss whether to continue the search. Captain William Reeves, who had investigated Private Yost's testimony about his December encounter at the plantation, argued for full disclosure and an extensive manhunt. "These women are dangerous," he insisted. "They've been conditioned to believe in ritualized murder. They're carrying remains of children. We have a duty to find them." But Kane faced pressures that transcended military duty. Georgia's provisional government, desperate to establish legitimacy and restore order, had learned about the Varden case through unofficial channels. A delegation arrived in Macon on March 25th with explicit instructions. The story must be contained. Sherman's army had generated enough atrocity propaganda. Adding a tale of cannibalistic plantation aristocracy would devastate Georgia's chances of favorable Reconstruction terms. The Army's Inspector General sent a directive dated April 2nd, 1864, classifying all Varden-related documents as sensitive intelligence. Cortland's patrol members received orders transferring them to different units across 3 states. Colonel Kane locked Temperance's journal in a sealed container marked for destruction after the war. The official record would show only that a plantation house burned during military operations, that several bodies were recovered from the property and surrounding area, and that the deceased family members appeared to have died from natural causes or suicide related to war trauma. The search for Constance and Abigail Varden officially ended on April 8th. Union forces had more immediate concerns as Sherman prepared for his march to Savannah. 2 women among thousands of refugees simply weren't worth the resources, especially when finding them would force the Army to acknowledge what those women represented and what evidence they might still carry with them. Reeves wrote a final letter to his superior on April 10th, a document discovered in military archives in 1938. "We have chosen institutional preservation over justice for murdered children," he stated. "History will not judge us kindly for this silence, but perhaps history will never know, which seems to be precisely what everyone wants." The Varden case disappeared into classified files and fading memories. Georgia rebuilt. The war ended. And somewhere in the reconstructed South, 2 women who had participated in 20 years of systematic infanticide walked among normal people, carrying secrets that would remain buried for another 60 years. The Freedmen's Bureau established an office in Macon in October 1865, 7 months after the war's end. Agent Theodore Marsh arrived with a mandate to document conditions faced by formerly enslaved people and assist their transition to freedom. He expected to catalog labor disputes, locate separated families, and mediate conflicts between former slaves and former masters. He did not expect to spend 18 months compiling testimony about systematic infanticide conducted by one of Georgia's prominent families. Ruth's initial testimony in August 1865 had mentioned the Varden family only briefly, focusing instead on labor conditions and unpaid wages. But Marsh noticed something in her careful avoidance of certain topics, the way she changed subject whenever December 1863 came up in conversation. He pressed gently, assuring her that anything she revealed would be documented and preserved. The truth mattered even when justice seemed impossible. What emerged over multiple interviews was a detailed chronicle of forced participation in horror. Ruth had worked in the Varden kitchen house since 1849, arriving as a teenager, sold to Colonel Varden from a failing plantation in South Carolina. She had witnessed 4 of the 7 ritualized murders, each one following an identical pattern that Temperance Varden orchestrated with military precision. "Mrs. Temperance would send for me the day after a child died," Ruth testified in October 1865. "Never the same day, always the next morning. She would have the infant laid out in the kitchen house on the preparation table we used for butchering hogs. She would tell me exactly what to do, which cuts to make, how to separate the organs, which portions went to which family member. She said if I refused, she would sell my children south to the sugar plantations, where they would be worked to death before age 20. Ruth's hands shook as she described the preparation rituals. Temperance insisted everything be done according to her written instructions, recipes that detailed cooking times and seasoning methods as though preparing any other meat. The organs were removed first, prepared separately for consumption, while the family prayed over Temperance's genealogical charts. The remaining flesh was roasted with herbs from the plantation garden, vegetables from the root cellar, presented on the finest china the Varden family owned. Isaac, the man who had watched the house burn from the forest, provided corroborating details from his position as the plantation's blacksmith. Temperance had commissioned special tools for the rituals, knives shaped to her specifications, a locked chest where these implements were stored between uses. "She made me sharpen them before each use," he told Marsh in November 1865. "Made me polish them until they shined. Said they were sacred instruments for sacred work. I wanted to run those blades through my own heart rather than prepare them one more time." A woman named Patience, who had served as housemaid, described being forced to clean the dining room after the ritual meals. The daughters would sit at the table for hours afterward, unmoving and silent, while Temperance read passages from her journals about ancestral strength and bloodline purity. Patience had been required to stand in the corner throughout these sessions, bearing witness to something she could barely comprehend. "Miss Margaret cried every time," Patience testified, silent tears running down her face while she chewed. Miss Catherine would vomit afterward, and Mrs. Temperance would beat her and make her consume it again. Miss Eleanor showed no emotion at all, like her soul had left her body. The younger two, Miss Constance and Miss Abigail, they stopped eating anything else. Between the rituals, they barely touched food. They were wasting away, but Mrs. Temperance said that was proper, that they should hunger for the sacred meals. The testimony revealed that Temperance's control extended beyond her daughters. She forced enslaved workers to maintain the cellar graves, to mark each burial with a cross bearing the child's name, to tend the sites as though they were honored memorials rather than evidence of ongoing atrocity. Anyone who questioned her methods faced immediate sale to traders heading to the brutal cotton plantations of Mississippi and Louisiana. Marsh compiled over 300 pages of testimony from 12 different witnesses between August 1865 and February 1867. He submitted his findings to the Bureau's regional office in Atlanta with a cover letter requesting federal investigation. The response came in April 1867. Case closed due to death of primary perpetrator and insufficient evidence to prosecute surviving family members whose locations remained unknown. The testimony was filed in Bureau archives, where it gathered dust for decades, another catalog of suffering in a nation trying desperately to forget the war and everything it had revealed about the depths of human capacity for evil. The Varden case remained buried until 1923, when a graduate student named Helen Pritchard stumbled across the Freedmen's Bureau testimony while researching her dissertation on post-war labor conditions in Georgia. She found Theodore Marsh's reports filed incorrectly in a box labeled agricultural disputes, mixed among mundane complaints about crop shares and unpaid wages. The testimony about ritualized infant murder stood out like blood on snow. Pritchard spent 2 years verifying the accounts against other archival sources. She located Cortland's suppressed military reports in the National Archives, found Colonel Kane's brother's letters in a Pennsylvania Historical Society, discovered the midwife Sarah Hendricks's diary in a private collection donated to the University of Georgia. Every source corroborated the same impossible story. The Varden women had murdered and consumed their own children across 2 decades, driven by genealogical delusions and matriarchal tyranny. Her dissertation, submitted to Columbia University in 1925, created immediate controversy. The academic committee reviewing her work questioned whether she had been deceived by wartime propaganda or fabricated evidence. 2 professors insisted the testimony must be exaggerated, that no Southern family of breeding and education could commit such acts. But Pritchard had documentation from multiple independent sources, testimony that aligned too perfectly across too many witnesses to dismiss as coordinated fiction. The dissertation passed with restrictions. The university required Pritchard to remove the Varden family name, replacing it with Family V throughout the text. They demanded she frame the case as unverified allegations rather than documented fact. The published version appeared in 1927 in the Journal of Southern Historical Studies, buried in a special issue on wartime atrocities that few scholars outside specialized circles would ever read. Georgia authorities responded to Pritchard's publication with aggressive denial. The State Historical Society issued a statement claiming her research was based on unreliable testimony from formerly enslaved people with grudges against their masters. They argued that Union soldiers had fabricated atrocity stories to justify harsh Reconstruction policies. Several prominent Georgia families with connections to the Varden bloodline threatened legal action if Pritchard continued publishing about the case. The threats worked. Pritchard abandoned historical research entirely, taking a teaching position at a women's college in Vermont, where she spent the next 30 years instructing undergraduates in proper citation methods and never mentioning the Varden family again. The case returned to obscurity, occasionally referenced in footnotes about wartime crimes, but never examined in depth. The story resurfaced in 1978 through an unlikely source. A forensic anthropologist named Dr. Marcus Webb was cataloging Civil War-era remains for a project documenting battle casualties. A colleague mentioned the old Varden plantation site, now abandoned farmland owned by a timber company. Webb obtained permission to conduct a survey, expecting to find nothing after more than a century of weathering and development. Instead, he found the cellar. Time and vegetation had concealed, but not destroyed the stone foundation. Using ground-penetrating radar, Webb's team located 7 distinct burial sites, exactly where Cortland's patrol had reported finding them in 1864. Excavation began in June 1979, with proper archaeological protocols and forensic documentation. The remains confirmed every detail from the historical testimony. 12 individual skeletons, all children under 1 year of age, showing systematic dismemberment consistent with butchering rather than burial preparation. Cut marks on bones matched patterns associated with meat processing. Skulls exhibited peri-mortem trauma, consistent with the preparation methods Ruth had described in her Freedmen's Bureau testimony. Webb published his findings in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 1981. Unlike Pritchard's historical analysis, his physical evidence could not be dismissed or suppressed. Bones do not lie, and these bones told a story that matched archival documentation with horrifying precision. National news outlets picked up the story. The case became a subject of true crime books, academic conferences, and eventually a PBS documentary that aired in 1989. Georgia officials could no longer deny what had occurred on the Varden plantation. The State Historical Commission erected a small memorial at the site in 1992, acknowledging the 12 children who died there and the enslaved people forced to participate in their deaths. But the memorial made no mention of the 2 daughters who had escaped, Constance and Abigail Varden, who had vanished into Reconstruction-era America, carrying their mother's delusions and the genetic legacy that had started everything. Those women had lived somewhere, perhaps married under assumed names, perhaps born children of their own. Their descendants might exist today, unaware that their family tree included branches that twisted into darkness so profound it still defies complete understanding. In 1996, a medical geneticist named Dr. Sarah Chen obtained permission to analyze DNA extracted from the Varden children's remains. Her findings, published in the American Journal of Medical Genetics, revealed what Temperance Varden had never understood. Her family carried a rare X-linked genetic mutation affecting male children exclusively. The condition caused severe immune deficiency, making male infants vulnerable to infections that their bodies could not fight. Without modern medical intervention, affected boys rarely survived beyond their first year. The curse temperance had attributed to weakened bloodlines and ancestral punishment was simply biology, a genetic mutation passing silently through female carriers, killing their sons with predictable regularity. Had Temperance lived in an era of genetic testing and immunology, her sons might have survived with proper treatment. Instead, her inability to comprehend medical reality had transformed natural tragedy into methodical horror. Chen's research estimated that approximately 30% of male children born to Varden women would carry the mutation. Some might survive through luck or milder presentations of the condition. This explained why previous generations had occasionally produced surviving sons, just enough to give Temperance false hope that her rituals might eventually work. The revelation prompted investigators to examine historical records for any trace of Constance and Abigail Varden after 1864. A researcher named Thomas Garrett spent 3 years following fragmentary leads through census records, marriage licenses, and church registries across the South. He found nothing definitive, only possibilities. A Constance Blackwell married in Tennessee in 1867, her maiden name listed as unknown. An Abigail Vernon, who appeared in an Alabama census in 1870, her birthplace recorded as Georgia, her family history blank. If these women were the missing Varden daughters, they had successfully erased their past and integrated into normal society. They might have married, borne children, died in respectable obscurity. Their descendants could number in the hundreds today, ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that their great-great-grandmothers had once participated in ritualized infanticide driven by genealogical delusion. The Varden plantation site remains mostly forgotten, a depression in Georgia farmland where wild blackberries grow thick over stone foundations. The memorial stands weathered and rarely visited. But the case itself has become a subject of ongoing study in fields ranging from forensic anthropology to abnormal psychology. A reminder that isolation, grief, and flawed understanding can transform human beings into something unrecognizable. 12 children died because one woman could not accept that biology, not curses, determined her family's fate. And somewhere in America today, people with Varden blood in their veins live completely unaware of the darkness that flows through their ancestry, a secret buried so deep that even genetic testing cannot reveal the full horror of what their family once became. If this story has disturbed you as much as it's disturbed historians for decades, then you understand why we document these cases. History's darkest chapters teach us what humans become when isolation meets delusion, when grief transforms into obsession. Click the like button if you believe these stories must be preserved, no matter how uncomfortable they make us. Subscribe to the channel because there are more buried truths waiting to be uncovered, more families whose secrets deserve to be spoken aloud. The past may be gone, but its lessons remain vital for understanding the fragile line between civilization and savagery that exists in every human heart.